behind me is a photograph of the Wilson Center. None of us is in the Wilson Center right this minute, but it is open for business to staff, and certainly our virtual programming is getting gigantic audiences. And the events that we have done on U.S. Mexico have gotten some of the biggest audiences. So it's a great credit to the staff who's on this call and to all of you that we offer so many impressive insights. So we have a star-studded discussion on U.S. Mexico relations with 6 current and former ambassadors, all of whom I consider friends, old and new. As many of you know, I was a 9-term member of the United States Congress from Los Angeles, a city I sometimes refer to as North Mexico. Growing up in my hometown, Spanish was spoken everywhere. A large number of people in my public schools were of Mexican and Central American origin, and certainly so much of the culture of Southern California is Mexican culture. So this is not a new topic for me, and focusing on U.S. Mexico relations, issues on the border is absolutely not a new topic for me. California is not the only state that borders Mexico. There are 4 other states and 6 Mexican states along the border that rely on their neighbors for trade, travel, and migration. And they felt the crunch during this pandemic as Washington and Mexico have closed the border to non-essential trade. It's not totally closed. Trade and business travel continue, but basically tourist travel has been halted. While travel has ground to a halt, the bilateral relationship shows some sign of moving forward. AMLO, as many of you know, visited President Trump recently, and that visit went extremely well. But to continue this relationship and to make sure it is healthy and growing, we need good ideas from the right people, many of whom are on this call and or working at the Wilson Center. And that is why the Wilson Center and the U.S. Mexico Foundation started Convocation, good name, a program that brings together former ambassadors between the U.S. and Mexico to identify challenges and opportunities in the bilateral relationship. The first edition was held in January in Texas with 6 ambassadors from each country. I'm really offended that nobody invited me. I would have come, but I hear raves about the meeting. I'm glad you're all smiling on Zoom. Yeah, next time, please invite me. But at any rate, the result of that meeting in January is the report we're launching today called Convocation, a Visit for a Stronger U.S. Mexico Partnership. And it includes specific recommendations across the 3 pillars of U.S. Mexico relations: trade and competitiveness, security and rule of law, and migration, plus the importance of public diplomacy and soft power in strengthening people-to-people ties. These are all strengths of the Wilson Center, and most of you have been around us forever. Thank you for that. That includes me. And I'm really proud that we are playing a role in this. So today, our star-studded cast includes, from Mexico, the current ambassador, Ambassador Bárcena, whom I look forward to meeting actually, not just virtually. The former ambassadors, my dear friend Arturo Sarukhan and Miguel Basañez. And from the U.S., we welcome current ambassador Chris Landau for his second appearance in recent times at the Wilson Center. And we also welcome dear friends Jim Jones and Tony Wayne. Ambassadors Sarukhan and Jones are also on the Mexico Institute's advisory board, and Ambassador Wayne has been incredibly active as a public policy fellow here and also chairs our North America initiative. Moderating and providing further introductions are Ambassador Wayne, U.S. Mexico Foundation Director Enrique Perret, and Chris Wilson, the Deputy Director of our Mexico Institute, all of whom have, again, been so helpful to this collaboration. Chris, rumor has it that in some lifetime, hopefully not soon, you may go somewhere else, but we really love having you at the Wilson Center. So I want to say that, even though you're barely recognizable under your quarantine beard, but we value so much your involvement with the center. So enough of me. Let me now turn the conversation over to Enrique, Chris, and Mexico Institute, Duncan Wood. And I think the next speaker is Enrique Perret. Over to you.
Thank you, Jane. Thank you very much for this welcoming remarks. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. My name is Enrique Perret. I'm the Executive Director of the U.S. Mexico Foundation. And on behalf of our board members and collaborators, I give you the warmest welcome. Today, we are pleased to present the Convocation report, a document with recommendations, ideas, and strategies put together by 12 former ambassadors of the bilateral relation. 6 months ago, back in January 2020, the U.S. Mexico Foundation, together with the Wilson Center Mexico Institute, managed to bring together 6 ambassadors, 6 former ambassadors from Mexico and 6 former ambassadors from the U.S. into the city of San Antonio, Texas. For 2 full days, we had a series of thematic sessions where they shared their experiences, took a stock of the results of specific public policies, and made specific recommendations, which are detailed in this report. The ambassadors play a specific role in the bilateral relationship. They have dedicated a lot of time and effort in improving this relationship, in bringing our societies closer together, in creating value through trade, culture, border infrastructure, migration, and development of many of our communities. Failing to take advantage of their experiences would be a loss in the search for the construction of more and better communication channels on both sides of the border. We hope this document contributes to the binational dialogue and that it inspires public officials, business leaders, legislators, civil society, and students as they look to create a better and stronger ties in this complex relationship between our 2 countries. I want to thank the Coppel family and the Wallace family for their support in this effort. Without them, this would not have been possible. I also want to thank Ambassador Marta Bárcena and Ambassador Christopher Landau, who have been very enthusiastic and supportive about this project since the beginning. They even sent us videos with their reflections for the kickoff of the retreat. In the coming weeks, we will be presenting this report to several audiences in the US and in Mexico to begin unwrapping the programs that arise from here. Please, if you have any comments, doubts, or any follow-up, contact us at the foundation or reach out the Wilson Center. Now let me start introducing our first 2 guest speakers, Ambassador Marta Bárcena and Ambassador Landau. Ambassador Marta Bárcena was appointed by President Andrés Manuel Lopez Obrador and ratified by the Mexican Senate on December 2018, a year and a half ago, becoming the first female ambassador to hold this position. Ambassador Bárcena joined the Mexican Foreign Service in 1979. Prior to arriving in Washington, D.C., she was posted as permanent representative to the United Nations Rome-based agencies. She has also served as an ambassador to the Republic of Turkey, non-resident to Georgia, and the republics of Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, and Turkmenistan. Ambassador to the Kingdom of Denmark, non-resident to the Kingdom of Norway and Republic of Iceland, and also consul in Barcelona. Ambassador Bárcena holds a degree in communication science from Universidad Iberoamericana in Mexico City, and a degree in philosophy, summa cum laude, from the Pontifical Gregorian University in Rome. She also earned a master's degree in international studies and a master's degree in political philosophy. Welcome, Ambassador Bárcena. I'm also introducing Ambassador Christopher Landau. On August 1st, 2019, exactly 1 year ago, Christopher Landau was confirmed as United States Ambassador to Mexico. He speaks fluent Spanish and earned a certificate in Latin American Studies at Harvard College. Ambassador Landau earned a Bachelor of Arts in History, summa cum laude, from Harvard College in 1985. He received his Juris Doctor, magna cum laude, from Harvard Law School in 1989, where he was Articles co-chair of the Harvard Law Review and won the Sears Prize for the highest grade points averaged in the second year. After graduating from law school, Landau clerked for then Judge Clarence Thomas of the United States Courts of Appeals for the District of Columbia Circuit. He later clerked for Associate Justice Anthony Scalia and Clarence Thomas of the Supreme Court in the United States. Landau joined Kirkland and Ellis in 1993 as an associate and became partner in 1995. He was chairman of the firm until he left 25 years later to join Queen Emanuel Urquhart and Sullivan in 2018. Landau was also an adjunct professor of administrative law at the Georgetown University Law Center in 2017. The Chief Justice of the United States appointed him to the Advisory Committee of the Federal Rules of Appellate Procedure. He's a trustee of the United States Supreme Court Historical Society and chair of the Society Programs Committee. Welcome also, Ambassador Landau. And with that, we're going to start the remarks from Ambassador Marta Bárcena. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Enrique. It's really an honor to be here to meet, even by Zoom, Jane. We have to meet personally together very soon, to be with you, with Chris Wilson, with my very dear friends, Tony and Jim and Arturo and Miguel Basañez. It's really, I feel thrilled to be here. I'm just returning after taking 5 days of holidays, because I must confess I ended exhausted after the visit that Jane mentioned. It was hard work. We have to prepare it very fast, and we have to deal, a lot of challenges that I think are very well reflected in the report of the Convocation. And while I was away, I read very carefully the report. And of course, I would say I agree with almost all of the recommendations that you do and the diagnosis that you do. But I would like to point out several issues that are related to the report and that make me think, how are we going to implement or do the follow-up of the recommendations that you make in the report on trade and competitiveness, security and the rule of law, and migration? And also to address to you some questions. First is these three areas, plus the one of public diplomacy, of changing the perceptions, changing the hearts and minds of the people at both sides of the border, and the issue of the border, which is very, very dear to me. And I think that is one of the huge challenges that we have ahead of us, how to make the border between Mexico and the US an example to the world. And it is already an example to the world in many areas, but for the good. It's how do we deal with this traditional agenda and with the framework of institutions that we have built along the years. Some of them are still working, like the International Boundary and Water Commission, and working well. And some of them, like I remember the cabinet meetings that we used to have when I joined the Foreign Service more than 35 years ago, and we used to have annual cabinet meetings of the US and Mexico, which were very fruitful. how do we deal with this framework in the face of having two governments and two presidents that can be considered disruptive for both the good and posing other challenges. So because that really take us out from the usual way of doing things. We as diplomats are used to deal with institutions and with processes. And I remember one of the debates that we had while we were negotiating the issue of migration and tariffs. And someone told me, you know, we need to have results, not get stuck in processes. And my argument was, we need processes to get good results. So how do we deal with these recommendations if we maybe cannot go back to what is business as usual in process? So, one question, for example, in one of the recommendations you say migration. The U.S. and Mexico should work on a bilateral framework for migration that puts it into a technical realm and not a political one. Is it realistic to do that? For example, we deal on everyday basis on technical matters. We deal what Jane mentioned at the beginning, you know, now the restriction on the travels at the border only for essential ones. We try to keep the trade going on. We are dealing on everyday basis on the implementation of Title 42. We are dealing on almost everyday basis with DHS and Department of Justice on the hearings for the Central American refugees waiting in Mexico. And so how do we advance those recommendations that you have made with this new environment? This new environment in the two countries, and then in a whole global new environment, because we have a crisis of multilateralism. We have seen an absence of, or not a strong presence of the US in international fora as we used to see before, and that we used to work before with the US also. We are seeing this competition that you reflect very well in the report, the trade competition between the US and China, and what does that mean for the future of our relationship. And I think we are working on the premises and we coincide with your recommendations that we will see a whole change of value chains in the world, a trend towards regionalization of value chains. So we have USMCA as a new template also of trade agreements with areas that we didn't see in other trade agreements before, labor and environment. And I hope that we will see those areas in trade agreements that the US will conclude with other countries too, that it's not only on the North American agreement. And how do we work with this new global environment to strengthen these value chains, to strengthen this interdependence, and to really make people understand at both sides of the border that we are these essential partners that you are saying in the convocation, that we are not anymore distant neighbors, but essential partners. Because I just tell you a story. The first time I went to Detroit, to Michigan, I saw the governor, Gretchen Whitmer. I had a meeting with businessmen. I had a meeting with authorities. And I told them, you know who is the third partner of Mexico in the US? No, I said Michigan. And we trade with Michigan every year, $69 billion US. The US trades with Brazil, 70 billion. And they were shocked. And then at one of the Detroit news, and one of the media said, an ambassador, then why did our previous governor went 6 times to China, not even once to Mexico? I said, you don't have to ask me, you have to ask him. But then you realize that in a lot of places in the US, they do not understand the importance of Mexico. not to say what I think is the most relevant element that I saw reflected also in the report of the Convocation, but I would have liked also to put more stress on that, which is the growing importance of the Mexican American community and the Mexican community in the US. And that we have seen this importance now during the COVID, because we have seen essential workers in the agricultural area, a lot of them Mexicans, undocumented, in the meat packing plants, at the forefront in hospitals, either as doctors, nurses, even cleaners, sanitary workers, and that you cannot explain what will be the future of the United States without the Mexican community and the Mexican American community, integral part of this growing Latinx community. So one also question is, how do we incorporate this community into the framework that you are proposing in your report of the Convocation? Can we work with them? Can they be the basis of some of the activities that you are suggesting, basically on the public diplomacy, basically on changing that terrible graphic that you put of the Pew Center that I am showing here? That it's terrible that people, when they listen about Mexico, they think about drugs, immigration, border wall, poverty and corruption and crime, but very few think about the Spanish, and the US is now the second largest Spanish-speaking country in the world. Very few people talk about people at the South, about destinations, about neighbors, about hardworking in very small, and Mexicans are hard workers. So we have a huge challenge in that, because to be able to really reach what we want and what you are suggesting in implementing USMCA, in attracting more investment from other regions to the North American regions to make it again more competitive than we are already, to really prepare our workforce for the future. We need to have a workforce that is bilingual and that they see themselves enriched by being bilingual, of how do we cooperate in technology and in other areas in culture, if most of the Americans think about Mexico as the land of drugs and corruption and poverty, instead of the land of opportunity, hardworking, and good people. So this is something that I wanted to share with you. I thought that the report will enrich us all a lot, that it will help us to advance on the path forward in implementing the USMCA, and of course on security matters and on immigration. And I must say that I would love to have a new framework for migration. But I think we will have to wait also on the political atmosphere in the US to advance on this. And if I can make mine, some of the recommendations, I mean, I like them all, I would put my emphasis on reinstating, relaunching this high-level dialogue, both on economic affairs, with the name high-level economic dialogue, on which other name we would like to add, and the dialogue of cabinet, of meetings at cabinet level. I have been very frustrated, and I must confess it, that, for example, we haven't had the Secretary of Security here, Alfonso Durazo, here in the US. I would love to have had him. I would love to have had some other secretaries too, because the relevance of meeting each other at the highest level, you know, all of you former ambassadors know how important it is. So if I will stick to that, said we have a huge opportunity with USMCA and with the all reconfiguration of the global economy in regionalization of value chains. I will concentrate one of the efforts of the embassy in that part, and on the institutional part on relaunching these high-level dialogues. Being economic, being on security, we have the high-level working group on security, but basically meets in Mexico. It has not met in the US, so we have that problem. And third, still working on these public diplomacy on this, but it's more than public diplomacy. It's really to change the hearts and minds to be able to work together as one community for the future. And then to reflect on other matters that are important that we have seen both in Mexico and the US now with the crisis. How do we deal with justice and inequalities in both our societies? And you address it also. How do we deal with those issues that are really the key for the future I think in many countries, but in countries like Mexico and now in the US, very important. So I would only say thank you. Thank you for giving us this report. It's always very enlightening to listen to trained and well-prepared and brilliant ambassadors of both countries. And I'm sure that each one of you had a very dear idea that you promoted during your term. These are my ideas based on your report, what I get through. And I just want to thank you again, the U.S. Mexico Foundation, Enrique, for your effort, the Mexico Institute at the Woodrow Wilson Center, and to all of you, the ambassadors that are here today and the ones that attended the meeting in San Antonio, the 6 from Mexico, the 6 from the US. Some of them were my bosses, like Jorge Montaño. He could not attend, but he was my boss for many years. And some of others have been friends for many years. And I just say, since I arrived here, I knew that I had big shoes to fill. The shoes were going to be big for me, but I've done my best and trying to represent well and to convey well the message of a government that has really signified a huge change for Mexico and a huge change in priorities and of doing things. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Bárcena. Ambassador Landau, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me okay?
We can.
Perfect. It's really an honor to be here today with so many distinguished fellow panelists and guests, and my dear friend Martha. It's a real pleasure to have the chance to talk to you all, particularly at the Mexico Institute at the Wilson Center and the U.S. Mexico Foundation, who I think do so much to advance our relationship by just having the time to talk through some of these issues and come up with reports. Many of you have been in government service before, and you know all too well that for those of us who are in the midst of this, it's always like drinking from a fire hose. We're always looking to put out one immediate crisis or something that looks like an immediate crisis. You don't always know when you're in the middle of it, if it's going to be a big deal or not. And we often don't have the time to sit back and reflect on some of the big issues, on some of the lessons learned. And I know I feel this very acutely. I used to be an appellate lawyer where my job consisted basically of sitting in my office and reading cases and writing briefs. And I really had the luxury of thinking through the issues. You know, here as ambassador to Mexico, it is such a rich and varied relationship that I must say I don't have that luxury anymore. It's always some priority of the day. I have tried to keep my eye on the ball by identifying 3 priorities since I arrived here a year ago. And fortunately, they're the same 3 priorities that you all have identified as the pillars of the relationship: economics, security, and migration. And because I think it's very important to always at least have a sense of where you want to go and what you want to achieve, to set realistic goals, but to set goals nonetheless. But I must say, I feel very blessed to be able to draw upon the great expertise of people like those of you who are involved in this report, my distinguished predecessors as U.S. ambassadors to Mexico, my dear colleagues as former Mexican ambassadors to the United States. And again, I want to thank you for your friendship to me personally and for your contributions to the U.S. Mexico relationship that is so important to both countries. Let me just say, when you all got together in January 2020, I don't suppose anybody really knew how the world was about to change. I certainly had no idea at that point. Even as late as February or early March, I really had no idea of what was coming. And I have to tell all of you, I think we're in quite a different world than we were back in January. I mean, that's not a particularly insightful comment or surprise, but you know, right now, everything has to be seen through the filter of the pandemic. It is very, very frustrating to be an ambassador in the middle of a global pandemic, because so much of what your job is getting out, meeting people, talking to people, seeing the country. And you can do some of that through Zoom and meetings like this, which I think are valuable, but it's not the same thing, obviously. And so, you know, it's been a real challenge. And, you know, I am concerned about the legacy of the pandemic. I mean, it's probably too early to start talking about a legacy because we're by no means out of the woods yet. And I suspect we may not be for quite a while. You know, this really didn't dawn on me until I'd say the last few weeks, when I kind of realized, you know, we're really in this for at least the medium term, that this is not just a temporary hiatus from normality, but this really is, again, to go with the cliche, the new normality. And we have got to identify and you know, kind of look to how we're going to try to address our priorities in this context. I kind of dusted off the whiteboard that I brought home with me when I made my home my principal office back in March. You know, among the possessions I took from the chancery to the residence were a whiteboard with all my priorities written there. And then that kind of sat behind a sofa for several months while we were just trying to deal with the immediate crisis of the day and keeping the supply chains open, working out, you know, what was going on at the border. But, you know, I have pulled up that whiteboard again in the last few weeks to say, okay, you know, now I don't think anything dramatic is going to change between now and next month or the month after that, or probably at least through the end of the year. So the question is, what do we do now? And it is very, very frustrating when you think about what might have been, all the ideas we had. You know, back in March, I was about to leave for a visit when we went into the lockdown to Houston to underscore the extent of Mexican investment in the States by inaugurating a major Mexican owned bottling plant in Houston. I think that's, as Martha kind of just alluded to, that's an incredibly important part of the story of U.S. Mexico ties that is, I think, very much under the radar, at least as far as a lot of Americans are concerned. And I think it's very important for people to understand how trade and commerce is very much a two-way street. So, you know, again, I think I am now trying to, within the context of the pandemic, you know, go back to underscoring these priorities. I will be visiting Chihuahua soon. It'll be my first official visit in Mexico since the pandemic started, in order to visit a number of plants, including the Ford Motor Company plant there, which is a very significant operation for not only Mexico, but all of North America. And I think it's very important to underscore that, you know, life goes on. We can't all stay at home forever. We have to obviously act very prudently and with in the context of the necessary safety protocols. And that's a hard message to send, because it's very easy to say, you know, to have it misunderstood and have people think that you're saying, oh, you know, this is over, the pandemic is over, you know, let's go back to normal. That is not the message, obviously, but, you know, it's a more nuanced message, and nuance is always a little bit hard to do, as everybody on this call knows. But I also want to highlight that there's a business, a factory that recently opened in Chihuahua that has come from abroad. It didn't come from China. It came from Poland, of all places, but came back to North America. And I think that's a very important message to be sending, particularly at this particular juncture. That was one of my takeaways from the meetings between the presidents at the White House earlier this month, that we need to go beyond rhetoric and really talk in a very practical way about how do we get companies and supply chains to come back to North America now with the new agreement. And I've been in very close touch with the Mexican Economy Ministry, working with all sorts of people in the Mexican government. I talk regularly to Martha about how we're going to do this, because again, I think there's a lot of win-win scenarios here, but it's going to be very tricky. And frankly, you know, the pandemic is going to leave us lots of legacies. I think I'm very concerned about obviously the economic situation in both countries. That has obvious implications for all the other issues of our relationship, including obviously migration issues, security issues. And so we are looking at a new world right now. And I think, you know, it's no longer really possible to look at this as a minor blip. I think this is going to be a watershed. You know, again, none of us knows. I certainly don't have a crystal ball as to what the future will bring. And you know, again, I'm trying to always look at the glasses half full, and I think in some ways it is. You know, the future goes to those who see these kind of crises as opportunities and take advantage of them. So that's certainly the mindset that I have going into this. And again, I look forward to a discussion with those of you on the phone here today. It's always a pleasure to see you, and thank you for inviting me. Gracias.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Landau and Ambassador Bárcena. Those were fantastic remarks to get us started. And you guys both really point out, I think very accurately, that we have both a huge number of opportunities, but also a huge number of challenges in front of us. And so we want to try to dig into some of that now with our former ambassadors who participated in the retreat. I'll just very quickly go through and introduce them to you. We have Ambassador, I'm going to go chronologically based on their time in Mexico. Ambassador Jim Jones, who was ambassador from, I think, 1993 to 97. He served as a member of Congress and as well as served in the White House. He's currently co-chairman of Monarch Global Strategies. Thank you, Jim, for joining us. Ambassador Arturo Sarukhan, who was ambassador from 2007 to 2013, Mexican ambassador to the United States, obviously. He's a career diplomat, having served in many posts in Mexico City, Washington, and New York, among others, and is currently president of Sarukhan and Associates consulting firm and a member of our advisory board at the Mexico Institute. Ambassador Miguel Basañez, who's ambassador from 2015 to 2016 of Mexico to the United States. He had a long career as a pollster and public official in the Mexican government and as an academic studying public opinion. And he's currently the director of special research and educational projects at Tufts University. And last but certainly not least, Ambassador Tony Wayne. He was the U.S. ambassador to Mexico from 2011 to 2015. He's also a career foreign service officer, held important posts, including ambassador of Argentina, deputy ambassador in Afghanistan, among others, as well as posts in the State Department and White House here in Washington. He's currently the co-chair of our Mexico Institute Advisory Board and also distinguished diplomat in residence at American University. Thank you all for joining us for this. Before I turn it over to Ambassador Basañez to begin conversation about the report and the findings and respond a bit to the ambassadors who spoke before me, let me just say, it was an absolutely fascinating conversation to be a part of this retreat that we held back in January. I mean, to be in a room for 2 days thinking deeply about U.S.-Mexico relations with ambassadors that represent 30 years of leadership of the U.S.-Mexico relationship is a really special moment. And we did our best to capture what that was like and some of the thoughts that were sort of emanating from that in our report, but there's nothing like hearing it from them directly. And so that's what we're going to do today. So we're going to now turn to some of the former ambassadors involved in the retreat. They'll talk to us about some of the main conclusions and how they sort of see that through the eyes of their time as ambassador. Have a little bit of dialogue with them. We'll then go back to the current ambassadors for short responses to what they're hearing from the former ambassadors. And then we'll enter a deeper dialogue all together and with all of you in the audience taking some of your questions. So if you want to submit questions via Twitter or Facebook to the Mexico Institute, feel free. If you'd like to submit a question via Zoom, there's a question and answer feature. You can submit one there as well. And then we'll just integrate those questions and bring them into the conversation as we continue it. So let me now turn to Ambassador Basañez. Ambassador, can you tell us a little bit about migration issues and the importance of sustaining public support? I mean, as a pollster and someone who studies public opinion, this is something you've looked at quite a bit, about the importance of sustaining public support in U.S. Mexico relations.
Sure. Thank you, Chris. And it's a pleasure to be here. And it was a real pleasure to meet back in January on that terrific setting. Let me begin by public support that I've been measuring through public opinion for quite a while. Polling has been surprising me about the perception on both countries since the first poll that I took on 1987 on migrants on Zacatecas and Guanajuato. And I was surprised, pleasantly surprised, to find that migrants were very happy with the kind of jobs that they had in the US. What they loved was going to the US for 4 months, 5 months, working hard, and then get back to Mexico. The second poll was in 1989 for the LA Times, when I learned that half of the Mexican families had a relative working or living in the US. When the result came back, I first told Bob Lewis, the director of polling in LA Times, no, that cannot be. I thought, I don't have a, and I was not finishing the sentence when I realized that I did have relatives living in the US. In '94, with a Canadian colleague, Neil Nevitt, and with Ron Engelhardt from University of Michigan, we wrote a book based on the World Value Survey that found that the values of the three countries were converging. That's the book called North American Convergence. Then in 2006, I got back to that data and I found that the converging was even deepening. So every time that I went through those, I was surprised for what I found. Now, let me talk about governmental changes on this public support, on these public perceptions. The nationalistic rhetoric shifted 180 degrees since De La Madrid, the president, a Harvard graduate, took office in 1982. Then that trend deepened even further when Salinas in '88 took office, and then NAFTA came in 1993. So that explains in a way that the Mexican favorability trend that the report shows that reached a peak with Obama, with 69 positive perception of Mexicans in the US, but it sank today to 30%, as the graph shows. Now, in Mexico, the favorability of Americans to Mexico has been much more stable, improving in the last 15 years from mid-40s to mid-60s. Now, let me finish my comments on this part, thinking on those two books of George Friedman, our colleague from Texas, that he titled The Next Decade and the Next 10 Years. He sees the US in a truly long-term perspective, and thinking, as Marta and Chris Landau said, this is a common purpose. These are common problems, and we have to find common solutions. Now, let me change rapidly to migration challenges and opportunities. I like to stress here that this topic is truly much more a common topic. The Mexican origin population born in the US before 1850 has been quadrupling every 50 years since that date. So there was a lot of Mexican origin population that they didn't crossed the border crossed them. Then when we think on those, particularly California and Texas, went from 125,000 Mexicans to 500 in 50 years, to 2 million in another 50 years, to 8 million. So those were Mexicans that were there before the US became what we know today. Now, the other aspect is that in 50 years of solid growth of Mexico, above 6.6% annual, what we now call the Mexican miracle, from 33 to 82, migration of Mexicans to the US was unnecessary. But then the Bracero program, at the request of the US during World War II, came. That paved the way for about 2 million seasonal migrant workers that showed the way. And then when migration really began from Mexico, was on the 20 years Mexican economic stagnation of the last 20 years of the 20th century. That drove about 1 million young Mexican risk-taker heroes, I should say, no language, no connection, minimal schooling, to adventure to the US job markets, from fruit picking, welders, childcare, gardening, cooking, cars, or dishwashing. But I will finish saying that Republicans knew about the business benefit of migrant labor, whereas Democrats were concerned on the negative effects on the labor markets. But since 2000, Mexican migration began declining, whereas Central American migration began increasing. So Mexico turned from a migrant's national exporter to a Central American bridge. Mutual benefits to work together in finding common solutions to common problems. I will let it there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Basañez. I'm going to now ask Ambassador Jim Jones to jump in and talk to us about some of the economic issues discussed at the retreat and in the report. I mean, especially now, USMCA has been not only negotiated successfully and ratified successfully, but we're beginning to implement it. How does that, open up space and change the dynamics and the relations, and what we should be thinking about in that sphere going forward based on your experience and your thoughts on that? Please go ahead. Let me just unmute you. We need to be able to hear you. Oh, there we go.
There we go. Thank you, Chris. Good to be with all my former colleagues in the Ambassadorial Corps and to participate in this particular program. I think one of the things that we all agreed on at the Convocation in Texas was that perhaps the most important event over the last century or more was the passage and implementation of NAFTA. And now we're into that second phase, USMCA. What it did was to bring a personal relationship between business people doing business in Mexico and vice versa, and let us understand each other as human beings, as opposed to the attitudes about each other. And so I think that was the most important event. We made some mistakes, which I think we can learn from. When I went to Mexico in 1989 or 1993, my first of 6 objectives was to increase commerce between our two countries, and to do that was to implement NAFTA correctly. The trade there, bilateral trade between the United States and Mexico when I went there, was I think $82 billion. It's now around $700 billion, an enormous increase in trade. That means an increase in wealth. And so we made a couple of mistakes. First of all, on the Mexican side, a mechanism for distributing that wealth more equitably did not exist. And then on the US side, we did not explain on a constant basis the benefits of trade to both countries, and particularly to the United States. So I think we can learn from those mistakes. Going forward, I think it's very important that we build or rebuild the institutions that make trade a good thing between our two countries. Starting with the high-level economic dialogue and the joint cabinet meetings between the two countries, I think that's very important. And it's unfortunate that there's been a drop-off in that in recent years. And one thing I would add to that, to the high-level economic dialogue, are representatives of workers. In the United States, and to a certain extent in Mexico, we lost track of the need to explain to workers how they could benefit from NAFTA and now USMCA. And we need to get that back in our activities. It's important because they provide the votes that is necessary to keep this trade relationship going forward. So that's one of the things that we did not do well. The second thing was to explain to the American public, to the Mexican public, the benefits of trade, why it's important, what it does for the country, what it does for our people. And that we need to do a better job of. In doing that, we need to take into consideration such things as workplace mobility and workers' education and training. That is a very important role. We have not really dealt with that in NAFTA, and it needs to be a part of USMCA. The training must recognize that as we go forward, if North America, and I think we should be thinking in terms of North America, U.S., Mexico, Canada, as opposed to just U.S., Mexico, going forward and being competitive as a region, economic region, we need to recognize the need to improve technology so that technology can offset lower wages and thus bring wages higher in all three countries. And to do that, I think we need to recognize that we've got to improve our education and training for our workers. We need to tailor our immigration laws in a way that allows for both short-term and long-term immigration, allows for the free flow of people in North America in both the skilled and unskilled areas of work. And I think we need to recognize such broad issues as climate change, and particularly as it affects the border regions. We discussed that in Texas, that the border needs to be upgraded in terms of having people recognize the potential destruction or the potential harm that climate change can do to the border region. So these are some of the things we need to look at going forward, and I look forward to questions. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Ambassador Jones. Ambassador Wayne, I just saw, I think you actually shared with me a Financial Times article about the increasing strength of the Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación. I mean, clearly public security and organized crime issues are a major challenge in Mexico these days, but as you well know, it's a challenge that crosses the border, right? I mean, that's partly fueled by drug demand and the money that comes from the United States. There's also issues of impunity in Mexico. You, during your time as ambassador, helped implement a good portion of the Merida Initiative efforts that have been underway for several years. What do you see as the sort of key takeaways and lessons on public security cooperation going forward, and the way that we can potentially sort of strengthen the institutionalization of those efforts in U.S.-Mexico relations?
Well, thank you, Chris. You're exactly right. It's one of the four key pillars of this relationship. And let me just mention those four pillars because we organize our report around discussion of them just briefly. One, as Jim Jones just said, is the economic area, which Martha and Chris also talked about. Very important. We have a number of opportunities there to take this forward. And one of the things we suggest in that report is that we bring MCA to recreate something like the high-level economic dialogue that we had in the past in various formats to deal with that range of issues that Jim was talking about. The second area that we look at and mention is migration, we talked about, and then people-to-people issues, which we've also talked about. And that leaves the fourth area, which is really hard to work on, and that is public security. And I think it's important to remember that in the United States, it was President Nixon that declared the war on drugs. Since that time, both governments have been struggling to succeed in that effort to stop the flow of illicit drugs, to stop drug addiction, and to stop the crime that goes along with that. We've had ups and downs along the way. We've had successes in some areas. But I think it's fair to say that the U.S. Mexico Partnership has not succeeded in getting this in a desirable place. And that we all agreed in this report that we need to double our efforts to address these issues, as complicated as they are. And I think it's important to note that they are very complicated for both governments and in both societies, because there are so many actors that are involved at the federal level, at the state level, at the local level. And there's a lot of incentive to send these drugs to the United States. It's important just to underscore, I think, that it's estimated that there are $18 to $30 billion in profits each year that are made by these illicit drug sales in the United States. You can buy a lot of guns and a lot of people with that much money in both countries. And it's a big, tough issue to work on. We very much advocated in looking at that area that the two governments double down on trying to establish both institutions that Martha mentioned. We are strong believers in institutions, all of the ambassadors that got together, because this is a relationship that's going to go on for a long time. It goes beyond any one administration. And so if you establish good institutions and patterns of trusting each other and working together, it can go on for years and get better if you do it right. And that's what we're proposing that we do in the security area. We propose that the two governments do a serious study of what's worked and not worked in the kind of security cooperation that's been going on, and a serious study in how drugs are now flowing and what different kind of drugs are flowing. One of the big changes that we note in the last few years is fentanyls and other synthetic opioids have been coming in from East Asia and getting up to the United States, and they are particularly lethal, and you don't need to smuggle as much of it to make a lot of money. So it's easier to smuggle. Now, there's still the other kind of drugs. There's still meth, and there's still heroin and other kind of bad things, but it's the synthetic opioids that has created a real shift and a need to do a detailed study on all these different patterns and then figure out how to go after them in both countries. It's I think, important to note that there are improvements in both countries that are needed, and that this issue is so big that it's much bigger than either country can handle by itself. It really does need to be a joint effort. So you need to have a number of specific focused efforts, for example, on fentanyl. What are the patterns? How do you attack that? How does it get into Mexico? Are people starting to make it in Mexico? how are they getting across the border? Then how does it get from the border to Chicago or New York or Los Angeles? It's not like there's a slingshot there and it ends up it lands in Boston. Some people are delivering this. So we have a whole network. And then once it gets delivered and it's sold, that money gets back somehow to Mexico. So it is a very complex effort. It's not going to work unless the two governments deal with it in the sense of the complexity that it is, and that they do so in the context of actually building mutual trust. And that is a problem. And we have to be honest about this. It's a problem because the cartels penetrate law enforcement organizations. They buy their way in or they threaten their way in. So it makes it doubly hard. And the way forward, we argue, is to really work very hard to have these very practical means of cooperation, both at the specific target by target area, but then also between the two governments, have a regular high level dialogue that exists and actually looks in detail at what progress has been made, where there has not been progress, and then everybody holds themselves accountable, because this is a problem that is causing the death of tens of thousands of people on both sides of the border. In the United States, you see this through the rise in deaths by overdoses. And in Mexico, very sadly, you see the rise in violent homicides, some of which is attributable to drug groups, not all of which, but some of which is, and is fueled by that. And so there are great benefits on both sides of the border if we can find a combination of practical and effective coordination to really learn from the past, keep adapting, and take this forward to a good result. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Ambassador Wayne. Very much appreciated and useful remarks. We're going to now turn to Ambassador Arturo Sarukhan. Arturo, you've often stressed the importance of not just sort of direct negotiation on these issues that we're calling the pillars of the relationship, but also the importance of soft power, of paying attention to public support and public opinion, of building policies and institutions that can outlive a single government. What lessons can you bring us from your time in Washington as ambassador? I need you to unmute your microphone, please. Thank you.
Thanks for reminding me. Thank you, Chris, and thanks, Enrique. And again, thank you for inviting us all in January to sort of, as former, as has-beens, to put our thinking hats on for a bit and try and look at this relationship going forward. I want to commend Ambassadors Bárcena and Landau for the yeoman's work they've been doing in seeking to ensure that the wheels of the bilateral relationship don't fall off during very trying times for the bilateral relationship. And it's obviously a great pleasure to be with so many colleagues from either side of the border. Tony and I served together, so we were in many joint battles in both capitals, playing the role of good cop, bad cop, and that is always an essential part of the ambassadorial work, as Chris and Marta know very well. I want to focus my remarks on four very quick topics. First of all, one of those that has already been mentioned here, which is processes and mechanisms. And you're absolutely right, Chris. The name of the game has to be, and that's why, despite these extremely difficult times that the relationship is going through right now, things more or less continue to work and continue to have traction, which is the mechanisms that have been built over the past 2 decades, particularly after NAFTA and the deepening and widening of collaboration that was triggered as a result of NAFTA coming into force. I couldn't avoid smiling there for a second when Miguel was referring to Miguel de la Madrid as sort of one of the turning points in sort of Mexican nationalism towards the United States. I want to remind Miguel only that one of the anecdotes that I usually use without attribution, I will use attribution now, is that when Miguel de la Madrid, the first Mexican president to go to Singapore on a state visit to meet Premier Lee Kuan Yew, because obviously Mexico was trying to sort of look at the Singaporean miracle and understand how, Mexico's connection to the world and GATT etc., could help Mexico grow. In the few minutes before the formal conversation between both heads of state started, Premier Lee Kuan Yew asks President de la Madrid, Mr. President, remind me how many kilometers of border does Mexico share with the United States? And de la Madrid, without batting an eyelid, said, unfortunately, 3,000 kilometers. Lee Kuan Yew looked at President de la Madrid, squinted and said, Mr. President, what would Singapore give for 1 kilometer of a border with the United States? And I mention this because precisely one of the points I want to make is that now in the context of the COVID crises, there is a strategic opportunity for Mexico, Canada, and the United States to really build upon a revamped North American Free Trade Agreement. It is a unique, it's one of those opportunities that comes around only once in your lifetime. And the three countries need to learn from the experiences of not having, from the get-go, aligned essential sectors in the three North American countries so we could diminish disruption of essential supply chains. And as we go forward, how do we really take advantage of this to become a true global economic motor by taking advantage not only of a 21st century framework. I always used to say that if you looked at NAFTA from the perspective of trade flows, these were 21st century trade flows. The architecture was a 20th century architecture, and the border infrastructure that feeds NAFTA was a 19th century infrastructure, because the last railroad crossing that had been built on the U.S. Mexico border dates back to the Mexican Revolution of 1910. So now that we have an updated, modernized North American Free Trade Agreement, Mexico and the United States and Canada have truly a strategic opportunity, but we must take advantage of it, and we must strike while the iron is hot. Along with this, which has been a concern of mine ever since I was head of policy planning in the Mexican Foreign Ministry, and more so when I was in the ambassador. Mexico has to become the strategic partner of choice of the United States in the Americas. And that means, yes, something that Mexican diplomats sometimes get very queasy, because it means saying bad things about our Brazilian friends. We need to ensure that Mexico is the strategic partner of the United States in the Americas and not Brazil. Because the day Brazil truly becomes, and we're fortunate that we have the president that we have in Brazil right now, it's an opportunity that we should be taking. If Brazil consolidates its role as a strategic partner and is seen in the US as the Latin American country that needs to occupy a permanent seat in the UN, Mexico becomes condemned to being domestic policy in the United States. And so the first issue is strategic opportunity. The second one is institution building. It was very interesting. One of the discussions that we had in San Antonio, in Rancho Blanco, was we looked at the experiences of the bilateral commission, which yearly brought secretaries from the cabinet on both sides of the border once a year. At one point in the relationship had matured so much and had become so deeply institutionalized and entrenched that policymakers on both sides of the border decided that we really didn't need that to start building upon what had been triggered by NAFTA. Now, curiously, we may be back at a point because of the disruption that is taking place on both sides of the border regarding the U.S. Mexico relationship. We may need that air traffic controller mechanism that the Binational Commission used to play and relaunch the U.S. Mexico Bilateral Commission as a way of ensuring whole of government approaches to common problems and common opportunities and common issues on both sides of the border. So this is an area where it's interesting that we are looking backwards in looking at mechanisms that played a very important role at a given juncture and which may be once again relevant because of the current lay of the land on either side of the U.S.-Mexico border and in the context of the U.S.-Mexico bilateral relationship. The third issue that I would like to focus on is public diplomacy and how this can be used going forward to create a sense of greater co-stakeholdership on either side of the Mexico-US border. We have a unique opportunity and we have a unique challenge. The unique opportunity, my baby, something that I worked on for many years, and which finally my vision was for a Mexico-US joint World Cup. It became North American in the process. That's fine, even better, because now we have the USMCA. But the 2026 World Cup should provide Mexico and the United States with the incentive to create joint public diplomacy efforts. That means Mexico and the United States together in the US, and Mexico and the United States together in Mexico. And if we look at what's going on as a result of the COVID pandemic, in terms of the huge, incredibly painful impact that COVID is having on the creative industries of either country, artists and filmmakers and chefs, you name it, the milieu that makes the culture and the creative industries on either side of the border, we need to help these sectors because they play a very important role in the economies of the United States and Mexico. Mexico may not be like the US, a superpower, but it is, like the US, a global cultural superpower. And both countries need to understand the role that our creative industries play and start developing policies that will help and aid these sectors on either side of the border. And the last issue that I think is very important here is to understand that a lot of the mechanisms that have been built over these past years are to create streamlined processes. And I'll take the media initiative, which has become a favorite punching bag these days, and everyone seems to be dumping on it. The media initiative was, yes, it was about enhancing law enforcement cooperation between both countries, but it was two things that were even more important. It was about streamlining and harmonizing processes on either side of the border to prevent the days that Jim remembers very well, when customs would have their favorite agency in Mexico, and the Pentagon would deal only with the armed forces, and the FBI or the DIA, each one would have their preferred clienteles in Mexico, and there was no understanding or ability of the federal governments, either in Washington, D.C. or Mexico City, to ensure that everyone was moving in the same direction, that there wasn't an overlap of resources, of commitments, that people weren't doing things that they shouldn't be doing. The Media Initiative, above anything else, was about A, processes, and B, goes back to my first point, it was about creating a strategic framework for U.S.-Mexico relations. In many ways, the Media Initiative was even more important than the bilateral law enforcement cooperation. It was creating a sense of co-stakeholdership regarding much larger strategic, geostrategic issues in the Americas and worldwide. So sometimes I think it's important to fly up to 35,000 feet and look at some of these mechanisms and processes and understand the institutional role that they've played in the modernization of the bilateral framework. Thank you, Chris, and thank you, Enrique.
Thanks so much, Ambassador. If it's okay with everyone, we're running a bit over in terms of the way we programmed things, but I think what would be useful is we have a lot of interesting questions and comments from the audience. Perhaps what I can do is just go through and read out some of those to give everyone on the call a flavor of some of the things we're hearing, and then return to first the current ambassadors and then the former ambassadors for just a final remark or two, or answer to one of the questions that you're hearing, or responding to each other, however you choose to use that time. So just a few of the things that we're hearing. I mean, one is something we've been talking about a bit, but the question is well put from an audience member. What would be different in the report if it was written in January of 2021 rather than in January of 2020? If we had the retreat a year later, how would that change the outcomes of things? Another is a note that we're in full-blown campaign mode in the United States right now, and given the importance of polarization and how that's impacted U.S.-Mexico relations in recent years, the polarization of immigration issues, of trade issues in the United States. How can we best sort of deal with that? And what can we minimize damage during this hyper-political period in the United States? Another about business-to-business relations. And we've talked about institution building on the government side. What about institution building and support from the private sector and from civil society, and how can we institutionalize that into the relationship better? I would return to just call out again the questions that Ambassador Bárcena posed to us during her own presentation, where she mentioned the disruptive nature of our presidents and how do we institutionalize given that challenge. I think that's a very interesting and real one. As well as to better incorporate the Latino community in the United States into this bilateral relationship, something that's been tried many times but has proven challenging. From the audience, another question about how security assistance through the Merida Initiative is responding to or not to COVID and the changing nature of bilateral relations and the growing importance of health security issues, whether we're sort of adapting to that in bilateral security assistance. There's several questions actually about the role of China in Mexico, the role of China in Latin America, how it is, given the tensions between the United States and Mexico, how it is the two countries can manage that, both economically and politically. On energy, a question about the AMLO government moving away from the energy reform of the previous administration in Mexico, and how it is that things like pipeline disputes and other contract issues that have arisen can be resolved effectively. And then finally, what we can do to strengthen the awareness and recognition from federal officials of the importance of border communities. Actually mentioned both the U.S. Mexico and the U.S. Canada border in the question, but how it is that we can better engage and recognize those communities in trilateral relations in this sense. So with that, let me leave it. I apologize to everyone in the audience whose question I wasn't able to get to. We've just been sort of flooded with great ideas and questions from you. Thank you all for your participation. And now let me turn back to first Ambassador Bárcena and Ambassador Landau, and then we'll go to the rest of the panel for just some brief closing comments and reactions. Ambassador Bárcena? We just need to have you unmute, please. Great.
Yes, I am. It says you are muted by host. No. Yeah. Do you listen to me?
We
Yes.
can hear you now. Thank you.
We can. Okay, so I will address some of the questions that you mentioned. First, I will address the issue of China in Mexico and Latin America. Just sharing with you some data. In 2019, the trade between Mexico and China was $90 billion US. Exports from Mexico to China were only 7 billion, and import from China was 83 billion. That shows you that we have a great capacity to look for other suppliers to Mexico, or to bring some of the products, the factories that make the products in China that export to Mexico. What is the main exports of China? Telephones, including everything that has to do with cell phones and all communication of voice and data, and accessories for office equipment. What is the principal exports of China to the US? Also telephones, also machinery for data processing, televisions, toys, and others. So that is the sections in which Mexico should concentrate to see if we can bring investment to Mexico, to Mexico and the North American region in general, so that some of the trade we can have as a kind of import substitution of the North American region. So China is for Mexico number 3 on our exports. It's very low with 7 billion. Number 2 of imports after the US, and number 2 of total commerce of Mexico, 10%. But if you go to investment, the investment of China in Mexico is very low. It's almost the lowest in all the Latin American region. It's only 1.3 billion US dollars. It's 0.23 of the total investment globally in Mexico. So as you can see, we have a challenge on trade, and we have a challenge on how to reorganize these value chains or these supply chains. In investment, the penetration of China in Mexico is much lower than in the rest of Latin America. And this is something that we have to explain, because a lot of people think wrongly that China is heavily invested in Mexico. It is not. It is more investment from the US and from Europe, particularly from Spain, Germany, the Netherlands, and the UK. So this, and of course in Asia, the biggest investor in Mexico is Japan, is not China, because of the automotive industry. So we need to understand these value chains, these supply chains, both for trade and for investment, to be able to take the right decisions. And that is why what Arturo was saying and what Jim Jones was saying and Tony Wei, and some of the questions, the business-to-business dialogue, which we have the CO dialogue, is key. But then if the dialogue just stay at the business sector is not enough, it has to go to the high level cabinet meetings or high level economic dialogue, so that we can take the appropriate measures to increase these movements of supply chains and to have the right incentives to attract the investment. The second thing that I would like to share, and I will just stop at that, I could speak for hours, but I will not do it. It's two things. On security and drugs, we are working very hard in the context of the trilateral NAD group, North American Drugs Consultation, basically on fentanyl, because one of the results of COVID that we saw is that some of the supply chains were disrupted by COVID. So what does that tell us? That still the precursors were coming basically from Asia. So if the value chains were disrupted, the supply chains were disrupted, we have to stop to let them, we shouldn't let them reconstitute. So we need to work on that. And one of the measures that we are discussing is aligning the list of precursors of US and Mexico so that they are the same. This is the kind of things that we are working. Another issue that we are working really hard on fighting transnational organized crime is on follow the money, really on freezing the bank accounts of the cartels, of the people related to the cartels. And we are working in the future, not just to freeze the accounts, but also to recuperate that money and also the properties. The properties, both of the transnational organized crime and the properties that were acquired based on corruption, even political corruption. And the third issue, and I will close with this, is that we are working and we like to work, we have discussed this with USTR and with the State Department, is how to establish a mechanism that could be complementary to USMCA on essential sectors. And it can have a double mandate. One mandate is how to align the essential sectors. As Ambassador Landau said, we worked so hard during the first weeks of COVID of trying to align the essential sectors. And you see the results of the trade of Mexico that were launched yesterday by INEGI, that were presented yesterday by INEGI. The trade in June went up almost 500% in comparison to May. Why? Why? Because the essential sectors, basically the automotive and the aerospace, were already aligned and trading in June. And the other sector, that committee for essential sectors could deal not only on the alignment of the essential sectors, but also on identifying which are the value chains that we have to bring back to North America and that we have to make North America more competitive. I will stop here. And as I said, I could go for hours, but it's enough. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Bárcena, and thank you for being with us today. Ambassador Landau, it's over to you.
Thank you. Just very briefly, I have to just say what a pleasure it is to hear so many thoughtful and insightful comments on the U.S. Mexico relationship. I think there's no doubt that this is the most important bilateral relationship in the world. I think certainly it is for each of our two countries. And I think it's only going to get stronger over time. I'm optimistic about the long-term trajectory of this relationship. There's certainly going to always be bumps along the way, but I think they're the kind of bumps and disputes you have within a family. And I think there's a strong sense, and the recent agreement only confirmed that we're on the same team. And I think that's so important. And I think it's relatively new. I don't think that was always the case for much of the 19th and 20th centuries, for obvious reasons. I wanted to pick up on one of the questions that was asked about civil society and businesses, because this is a big theme of mine that, Martha and I are the two ambassadors at the moment, and, to some extent, therefore, we represent the bilateral relationship, but there are so many ambassadors who actually, I think, are far more consequential. I think it's people like all of those of you on this call who care about the bilateral relationship, who study the bilateral relationship, the businesses who invest on either side of the border, the students who go back and forth. I think that is the connective tissue that ultimately keeps the relationship strong. Again, we're going to have ups and downs at the governmental level. I think the overall arc or trend is moving in the right direction. I think it's important that these bilateral relationships transcend political party on both sides of the border, because these are two countries and two peoples that have a relationship, not just individual political parties or politicians. So I just want to say, I always believe that it's part of my job to highlight some of these other aspects of the connective tissue of the relationship. And it's why I enjoy so much participating in events like this and think they're so valuable. So thank you for inviting me, and I look forward to continuing to work with all of you. Gracias.
Thanks so much, Ambassador Landau, for joining us today and for your comments. Let me now just turn back we'll go back in the same order that we began, to each of the former ambassadors for a quick closing comment or response to a question. Ambassador Basañez?
Thanks, Chris. What I would like to say is that I look forward to our next meeting in 2021 at the retreat on the convocation of the Wilson Center and the U.S. Mexican Foundation. I'm pretty sure that we will have very good ideas exchange. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Ambassador Basañez. Ambassador Jones.
Just quick comments on the China situation. I think the United States and Mexico together should move to become, to move those factories and what have you to Mexico and to North America. And I think that could be the most effective way to combat our our relationship with China if they lost some of those factories.
It's 11 o'clock.
On the second thing, on institutional building, I think it's very important because institutions properly constructed and properly manned will outlast any president. And so it's very much harder to change the direction of a country if the institutions are strong and positive. So I would just make those comments. On the final thing, AMLO either needs to just totally upset and change the energy policy in Mexico, or recognize that it's going to really disrupt his ability to get more investment in Mexico. And I think that needs to be re-examined by President Lopez Obrador. Thank you.
Thanks, Ambassador Jones. Ambassador Wayne.
Thank you. Well, I think that everybody's comments have underscored that this relationship really demands hands-on, detailed work every day. And that's why you need frameworks in which that they can work. So with the business community, I think it's exactly right. There needs to be different arrangements to have this kind of dialogue about supply chains, about essential sectors, not just between governments, but you have to involve the private sector. After all, they built these supply chains over 25 years, and they want them to work effectively also. And they're going to work better if there's a dialogue, public-private dialogue, in figuring out how they can work. And this is also for looking to the future. One of the big goals of USMCA, it set up a committee to look at competitiveness of North America in the future. We need that dialogue that has to have business, has to have, you know, experts from academia, has to have others involved with government. So we've got to create these fora, and that's the same thing at the border. This is a big, complex border, as a number of us have written, and Chris Wilson is a specialist on the border. He knows this very well. So you need to have different fora in different parts of the border that bring together civil society, the private sector, and government officials to figure out how do you make this more productive for everybody. You know, that on both sides of the border, if you put it together, you've got the third or the fourth largest economy in the world from those border states. There's a lot going on and a lot more that can happen if we get the formulas right, if we get this dialogue right, and if we invest in it. So there's a lot positive that we can do for both countries if we get these dialogues and these frameworks right. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Ambassador Sarukhan.
Thank you, Chris. I'll try and very, very quickly take on three of the questions that you shared with us. How different would the report have been if we had been meeting in January 2021? Certainly COVID would have I think, been the unifying discussion point of all the issues that we're looking at, whether it's how COVID is disrupting drug supply chains, particularly from Asia, as it relates to fentanyl, how it's recreating cocaine supply routes through Quintana Roo now to offset the losses being incurred by the lack of precursor chemicals coming in from Asia into Mexican ports. Obviously, the supply chain and border management issues, pandemic and lessons learned from the pandemic. These would have been core elements of the report had it happened a year from when we convened. Obviously, the other big 800-pound gorilla in the room would have been that by then we would have known what happened on November the 3rd, and that would give us obviously a sense of strategic direction as to what type of relationship we need to be looking for in terms of the outcome and results of the U.S. presidential election. On the issue of sort of non-state actors, this is going to sound weird coming from a guy who spent 23 years in the Mexican Foreign Service, but I think the future of the U.S.-Mexico relationship, yes, Mexico City and Washington obviously are important, and the executives of both governments are important, but the future of this relationship will be built on mayors and governors. It's at the state and local level that we will build the density of ties that this relationship needs to develop going forward, not only because it's at the local and state level where the conveyor belt between public policy and citizens is more relevant and more alive, but because of the connections, trade, social, economic, cultural, that exists between mayors and governors on either side of the border. And then the issue of the Latino community in the US. This is a key aspect of Mexican engagement in the US, and it has to be predicated and it has to be built on a shift in the paradigm. And it has to be not what these communities can do for Mexico, it's what Mexico can do for those communities in the United States. Help empowering them, to help advocate for them, to defend their rights at moments where many of them feel under siege. And so Mexico's role, instead of what evolved over many, many years, including during the NAFTA negotiations, which is, oh, we're going to use them to lobby on behalf of Mexico and the United States, it should be the other way around. It's Mexico supporting them on the ground in the United States in those issues and those causes and in their political, economic, social, and cultural empowerment in the United States.
Thanks very much, Ambassador Sarukhan. I mean, as you have all seen, this has been a panel of the sort of the rock stars of U.S.-Mexico relations, the experts. As one of our audience members put it, it's been a masterclass in U.S.-Mexico relations. So thank you so much to our panelists. Let me also thank Enrique Perret and the U.S. Mexico Foundation for their amazing partnership in this initiative. I mean, I think what's become very clear to me is that we're going to need to have another round of reflection and thought about the future of the relationship in 2021. after the November elections, after the full scope of the implications of COVID and its impact on supply chains and other issues becomes more clear. This is such a dynamic relationship that we can do our best to keep up with it as experts and as former ambassadors and current ambassadors, but it has to be a constant process of reflection to really guide us forward correctly. So once again, thank you to everyone that joined us today. Thank you to Ambassador Bárcena, Ambassador Landau, Ambassador Basañez, Ambassador Jones, Ambassador Wayne, Ambassador Sarukhan. Please stay in touch. Please read the report on the Mexico Institute website, on the U.S. Mexico Foundation website, and we'll be in touch again soon to do this again. Thank you.
Adiós, amigos.
Gracias.
Adiós a todos y muchas gracias de nuevo. Thanks very much. It was
Gracias,
great to see you.
embajadores.
Gracias.
Gracias a ustedes.